Hi, everybody, and welcome to another SA Smart Chats. My name is Natasha Wilkerson. I am the co-chair of SA Smart, the Mayor's K-12 Smart City Challenge. As you know, we're talking about water, and I have a special guest with me today. This is Steve Clouse, the Chief Operating Officer of the San Antonio Water System. All right, Steve, let me give them a little bit of your bio, and then I have lots of great questions. I know you have information you want to share with the students. So Steve began his SAWS career working as a sample collector in the wastewater pretreatment division in 1985. He currently leads the operations and engineering activities at SAWS. As Chief Operating Officer, Steve provides oversight of SAWS's $600 million per year, 5-year capital program, and leads a team of approximately 1,000 professionals. I had no idea it was that big, providing water and wastewater services for 1.8 million people. Wow. You have an undergraduate degree in aquatic biology from Southwest Texas State University and a master's in public administration from Webster University. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right, so I just gave the students some numbers, 1,000 people that work at SAWS and then 1.8 million that receive the services. So let's give students now this big picture. They're probably unfamiliar with the water system. So what is the role of SAWS in providing access to water?
Well, just think about it. Everywhere you drive in San Antonio, you drive around Loop 410, you drive all the way around Loop 1604. We have the infrastructure underground that provides water to all those people. So nobody really thinks about how much infrastructure that really takes and the work it takes to keep all that infrastructure operating, maintained. And every time a new subdivision goes in, that's more infrastructure that we have to take care of. So all of the water pumping stations and all the pipes, let me just put it in perspective. We have about 12,000 miles of pipeline that we take care of. So what does that mean? 12,000, big number. If you went from New York to LA and back 2 times, long trip, and all of that distance is somehow packed underground in Bexar County, a big spaghetti bowl of pipe, getting water from here to there that we have to take care of. It takes a lot of people, takes a lot of planning, takes a lot of effort to get all that done. Of course, we run the water side of the business. We provide everybody's potable water in San Antonio, with a few very small exceptions. And we run the wastewater side of the business. And it just takes a lot of really dedicated and super smart people to be able to handle things like that. So what does water mean to San Antonio? Let's think about that. Mm-hmm. I think water is the most fundamental building block to the health of the city. And it's such an important job that we are successful in what we do. If you want to think about it this way, it doesn't matter if you have the best police force or the best school system or the best medical facilities. If you don't have water, if you don't have adequate and clean water, you won't have any of those other 3 things. So we have to be successful. The entire community absolutely depends on us being successful in the delivery of that service every single day of the year. You can't take a day off. You've got to be successful. And that's how we have to plan our service overall.
And in talking with all these different experts at SAWS, I've just learned so much, and I didn't realize how complex this problem is. And one thing that's been brought up with some of the other speakers was, last year when the power went out in San Antonio and there were millions of people without water. So what are some of the vulnerabilities that SAWS is trying to tackle?
Well, so when you go back to what happened in February, we had at one point in February, I think it was the 17th to the 18th, the coldest day that we went through. We had 400,000 people that had no water in San Antonio. You could turn on the tap and nothing was going to come out. And on top of that, because we were having such a difficult time providing water, we had to issue a boil notice in San Antonio where we recommended that every single person, all of those 1.8 million people, had to boil their water before they could drink it or use it for cooking. Never seen that before in the history of SAWS. It's never happened before. That's
Wow.
all there is to it. Of course, that happened because we didn't have power. We couldn't run our pumps to get that water or move that wastewater overall. That's just such an enormous challenge for us. To put it in perspective, how much power do we use? Just let's talk about it that way. Everybody looks at their power bill in San Antonio. Everybody on this recording will soon know what their power bill means. You know, it's expensive for your water and wastewater bills. The SAWS water bill for power is now about $34 million a year. That's what it cost us just to pump the water. So when people talk about the cost of water and, you know, why does SAWS have costs like they do to provide that service? Well, think about that 12,000 miles of pipe that we have to take care of, and think of the fact that just to lift that much water to be able to get it to people cost us, from an energy perspective, $34 million a year. And that number, of course, will grow up as San Antonio grows, as the cost of power increases in San Antonio. We just had a rate increase yesterday for power. And that rate increase on power has a direct impact on SAWS and what we have to do to be able to get water to people.
And talking about boiling water whenever the power went out, why was that, or why were citizens required to boil their water?
Well, we're required to keep an adequate amount of pressure in our system. When you turn on the shower, you've probably been to different parts of town, and you might see different levels of pressure. The water comes out harder from your tap in some parts of town than others based on elevation. And if we fall below a certain level of pressure, there's a higher risk that contaminants could get sucked into our system, or maybe there's an industrial process operating somewhere in town, a big industry that has to put additional pressure on the system to inject chemicals into their process or something along those lines. If we don't have an adequate level of pressure, then it's possible that other things could get pulled into the system, and nobody wants contaminants from other sources getting into their drinking water. So if we don't have an adequate level of pressure, if we can't absolutely assure people that that water is safe to drink, that you can give it to your grandmother to drink, that you can put it in your baby's nursing formula, then we put a notice out that we recommend you boil it. That's an extremely rare occurrence. But because we lost pressure across so much of our system, there was just no choice but to go ahead and issue a boil notice. It only took us 3 or 4 days ultimately to get out of it. But without the ability to pump that water, without the ability to push, we couldn't build pressure. So we had to go into a boil water notice.
And I imagine another challenge with that was communication, getting that message to the customers that don't have power and maybe they're not watching TV. How did you get the message out?
Well, that's difficult. If you recall, so many people, their homes were without power too, so they couldn't turn on their TV. We went to every news station we could. We did every radio spot. But one of the most effective ways, what we learned in this storm, and I think it's one of those changing dynamics in our culture and society, the best way to reach all those people was by social media. And because whenever someone did get power at their house, or they even ran out to their car to charge up their cell phones, the first thing they did as soon as they had power in their cell phone was start looking for information online. So through social media, through use of tools like Nextdoor and that sort of thing, we pushed that message out through those avenues, and it was probably our most successful effort ever.
Now let's talk about weatherization, which is a term that students probably are not familiar with. So if you could explain that, and what are some challenges related to water?
Okay, so when we design and build the system, there are a lot of engineering aspects that we have to put into that design on what is it that we want to see in this pump station that we build or in this wastewater plant that we build. How do we want to set that up in a way that we can rely on that service? And one factor is, what is the temperature that we live in? San Antonio, the design for a station in San Antonio is very different than, say, something in Denver or in far North Dakota. We designed for a more moderate climate because we don't want to over design. We don't want to spend money that doesn't need to be spent. And we designed for our region. And what this winter storm told us is that those temperature extremes are broader than what we've seen in the past. We need to plan for colder weather than what we historically have seen. So we now have to go in and sort of retrofit a lot of our systems to make sure that they're capable of handling extremely cold weather. That can be a multitude of things. Whether we wrap more of our pipes, whether we put in more heating stations at all of our pumping facilities, even things like when we lost power, we've never built our systems where if we lost power and it was extremely cold, we drain those systems, intentionally drain those systems. We've never experienced anything like that before. So we're just using the lessons that we learned as a result of that winter storm, coldest weather we've seen in really the history of San Antonio. And we're going back in and we're sort of retrofitting a lot of our infrastructure to be able to handle that in case we see that again. Certainly, we hope we don't see it again, but in case we see it again. Now, the other side of that, and the thing that I think about more than freezing in San Antonio is what we'll all experience in June, July, and August, are those extremely hot temperatures. And we have to make sure that our facilities are ready for the climate change that so many scientists tell us to be ready for. So what was a regional weather pattern that we could depend on in the past is no longer that. We have to have a much broader range of temperatures. The bottom line is it costs more money to have systems ready to handle that wider range, but we're moving forward now to make sure that our systems are more resilient to both of the weather extremes, not just what we saw in February.
And in February, what happened when it got so cold and the power went out and houses were freezing? What was the impact on the system?
Okay, so the power went out not because our local electrical provider decided to turn people off. And I want to make sure people realize that. CPS Energy, I know those folks, they do a fantastic job. They're ultimately dedicated to providing power to people, but they were told by an entity controlled by the state that we needed to cut power. So they obligated our local electric utility to cut the amount of power they were providing to people. When that happened, they had to cut so much power that they even had to cut our pumping stations overall. So I was on the phone with those folks. It's 2:00 in the morning. People didn't go to bed for a very long period of time there as we were trying to work through that evolving crisis. No one ever predicted that the state would come back to us so many times and so quickly with more cuts and more cuts and more cuts. And why do we need to do that? Why do we have to cut all this? Why is the state telling us to do that? Well, the amount of electrical generating stations in the state were also freezing up, and we couldn't produce the energy across the entire state. So the state then had to tell the local electrical providers to start cutting. And if we didn't try to balance the demand, how much we were producing, what we were producing with the demand, everybody had their heaters turned up to the max because of that cold. Right. If we get an imbalance in the electrical system, if we don't watch that very carefully, it will actually start to destroy electrical equipment. So to keep from destroying our big power stations, we had to start shutting them off. So it was an incredible learning experience that showed us that not only the water system needs to go through weatherization, but also that the big generating stations and the fuel suppliers to those generating stations need to do a lot of work as well to improve that weatherization. So that was the tug of war that we were all going through, trying to work through that event. Like I said, at of course 2 o'clock in the morning,
Wow.
and ultimately the impact fell down to individual homeowners and the folks that live there. Just like their home had been turned off and they didn't like it, our water pumping stations were turned off, and it really showed us that we have a vulnerability that we need to plan for.
Well, I think that's a lot of great information for teams as they try to tackle this issue. And I want to end with a more personal question of, how did you get into the water business?
Well, as you heard, my degree is in aquatic biology. I grew up on a stream just north of San Antonio. My parents had a little piece of property, and there was a creek there, and I was always really just interested in what was going on in that stream. So I got a degree from aquatic biology, and when you get into that type of a career, you think you're going to be riding horseback in Montana, sampling some pristine stream. But I wound up getting into the water business, specifically the wastewater business, because wastewater plants are the lifeblood of those streams. Most of the streams in Texas are really effluent from wastewater treatment plants that have already been through the system once. That's how it is. New Orleans, that water's been through 7 treatment plants before it goes past New Orleans. So that is the level of interest that I had, and it just drew me into this business automatically.
Well, I appreciate your time, and it's been so fun talking to all the different experts at SAWS. I feel there's a real passion in the organization on this really critical issue. So I know I've become excited about water and helping tackle it. I know the students will too. So good luck, teams out there. I hope you got some good information, and I look forward to seeing what you come up with. And thank you again, Steve, for joining us.
Thank you, Natasha.